The heroin, hidden in pizza boxes. In the neon-soaked sprawl of 1980s New York City, where cab horns wailed like warning sirens and alleys pulsed with the heartbeat of sleepless ambition, there was a scent that clung to the streets. Not smoke, not sewage, not even the sweet tang of roasted chestnuts in winter. It was oregano, baked deep into the air by thousands of pizza ovens lining the city's boroughs. To the untrained eye, these mom-and-pop pizza joints were cultural icons, Italian enclaves of warmth and crust. But to a handful of FBI agents, they reeked of something far more sinister. Across Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island, an odd pattern emerged. Seemingly unconnected pizza parlors were receiving strange deliveries at odd hours. Wooden crates marked as imported olive oil, canned tomatoes packed unusually tight in small shipments, followed by late-night visits from men in sharp suits and colder eyes. When a 19-year-old junkie was found dead in an alley behind one such establishment, a pizza box at his feet and a needle still warm in his arm, Agent Louis Free, then a rising star at the FBI's Organized Crime Division, knew something didn't add up. The autopsy showed the heroin was unusually pure, unadulterated, untouched by the typical street-level adulterations that stretched profits and diluted danger. Someone somewhere was sending a message: we own the supply, we don't cut corners. And the heroin, it was coming in waves. From Harlem to Chicago, from Miami to Milwaukee, overdose rates surged. But what was strangest was where the trail led back to small, unassuming pizzerias. They weren't chains, they weren't known to franchise. Yet many bore names that rang with Sicilian charm: Bella Napoli, Don Pepino's, La Trinacria, all registered under different owners, all connected through an invisible web. Agents dug deeper. They sent in informants. They surveilled dumpsters. They mapped delivery vans. Patterns began to emerge: common distributors, recurring license plates, off-the-books laborers flown in from Italy. Then came the tip. An anonymous call to a DEA field office in Newark whispered of a man in Sicily, a ghost in a suit, who bakes heroin like it's bread. His name, Gaetano Badalamenti. The informant was shaky. He wouldn't say more. But the name stuck. Badalamenti wasn't a ghost to everyone. In law enforcement circles, his name had surfaced before quietly in closed-door meetings among whispers of a Sicilian heroin pipeline. But until now, he'd evaded every net. Now he had a name. Now he had a calling card: pizza. A joint task force formed within weeks. FBI, DEA, and Customs pooled resources under one banner. They called the operation Pizza Connection. It started as a joke in the office, agents sharing slices while studying surveillance photos. But the deeper they looked, the colder the laughs got. Wiretaps were approved. Bugs were planted under counters behind espresso machines, even in tomato sauce barrels. Hours of tape were logged. Hours turned into days, days into months. Voices spoke in code. Send more mozzarella to Chicago. The tomatoes are too hot this week. Gaetano wants more heat in Milwaukee. Hidden in those words was a symphony of narcotics trafficking, precise, brutal, and disciplined. Heroin disguised in vacuum-sealed coffee bags. Cash laundered through nightly pizza receipts. Assassins ordered like delivery drivers. Then came the night in Queens. Agents trailed a delivery van leaving Luigi's Pizza. It made no deliveries, no drop-offs, but it parked in an alley and exchanged a crate with a man in a dark Mercedes. When the agents moved in, the crate shattered open. Inside, pure heroin, 17 pounds, enough to kill a city block. This wasn't street crime. This was an enterprise, structured, international, quiet. What chilled investigators the most wasn't the volume of heroin. It was the elegance, the way shipments moved like clockwork, the way the operators didn't brag, didn't flaunt wealth. They didn't need to. They already owned everything: the distribution, the storefronts, the loyalties of whole neighborhoods. The only thing they didn't yet own was the silence of law enforcement. But they had come close. One agent recalled later, it wasn't just a drug case, it was a war of perception. Everyone knew these places. Everyone loved their food. How do you arrest nostalgia? The next phase required patience, deep infiltration, strategic arrests, flipping insiders, and ultimately a plan to hunt the ghost Badalamenti. Because if the pizza shops were the fingers, he was the fist. The Don from Sinisi. Before his name haunted courtrooms in Manhattan and echoed through FBI surveillance reports, Gaetano Badalamenti was just a boy from Sinisi, a dusty Sicilian town where time moved slowly and silence held power. Sinisi, nestled along the sun-bleached coast of northwest Sicily, was no stranger to secrets. Narrow streets, twisted like conspiracies, and old men sat on stoops, watching the world with eyes that had seen too much. It was here that the Mafia didn't need to hide. It was tradition. Born in 1923 into a world ruled by omerta, the code of silence, Gaetano inherited more than just a surname. His family, modest but respected, had long-standing ties to local influence. His uncle, Cesare Manzella, was a rising figure in Cosa Nostra, known for distributing favors and punishments with the same calm smile. Young Gaetano watched closely. He learned how power didn't need to shout. It simply sat at the table, waited, and made others speak first. By his 20s, Gaetano was moving shipments, not drugs yet, but black market goods after World War II. Cigarettes, sugar, oil. Sicily was poor and America was rich. He found ways to bridge that gap for a price. He was smart, not just with logistics, but with people. He listened more than he talked. And when Manzella was killed in a car bomb in 1963, pieces of him scattered like ash across Sinisi. Gaetano didn't cry. He stepped forward, took his place, inherited not just the network, but the unspoken debts, the quiet loyalty of frightened men. The world was changing, the Mafia was evolving, and Badalamenti saw heroin. He understood that drugs were risky. Old dons resisted. Drugs bring heat, they said. They rot communities. But Gaetano wasn't moved by tradition. He was moved by opportunity. The demand in America was insatiable, the profits unfathomable. What he envisioned wasn't chaos. It was an economy, a system. He wasn't interested in street-level dealers or turf wars. He saw international trade front companies, transport corridors. He didn't just want to sell heroin. He wanted to manage it like a corporation. In the late 1970s, when the heroin market exploded, Gaetano Badalamenti was already ahead. He forged alliances with Turkish suppliers for raw morphine, hired chemists in Palermo to refine it, and created a distribution web that spanned continents. But he knew he needed a disguise, something familiar, something adored, something that could sit on any corner of any American city and never raise a whisper. Pizza. He began sending trusted lieutenants to the United States, not soldiers but bakers, managers, cousins. They opened restaurants. They learned English. They sold real pizza by day and trafficked heroin by night. Each shop a node, each delivery a code. Back in Sicily, Badalamenti kept his hands clean. He wore tailored suits, attended baptisms, made donations. He presented himself as a dignified businessman, a patron of the town. He kissed babies and blessed weddings, and yet in the shadows he ruled with precision. Disloyalty meant disappearance. Weakness meant removal. His orders traveled like whispers, but landed like thunder. He preferred control over cruelty. His strategy was containment power, not through fear, but inevitability. You didn't say no to Badalamenti because you didn't see another option. By the early 1980s, he was no longer just a Don. He was the Don. His influence reached from Palermo to New Jersey. His face was unknown to most of his American operatives. That was intentional. He wasn't there to inspire loyalty. He was there to maintain structure. But cracks were forming. Rival factions grew jealous. Younger mafiosi, eager for quick gains, called him old-fashioned. Some whispered that he was too cautious, too slow. A war brewed within the Sicilian Commission, the governing council of Mafia families. And when that war erupted, Badalamenti found himself on the wrong side. In 1978, the Commission expelled him, accusing him of disloyalty, of breaking the unspoken codes. He had moved too independently, spoken to too many outsiders, refused to bow to younger, hungrier wolves like Salvatore Totorina. But Badalamenti didn't go quietly. He fled to Brazil, then to Spain, always one step ahead, always with false passports, hidden vaults, and loyal shadows. From exile, he kept the empire running. He adjusted routes, changed contact names, trusted fewer people. But the heroin kept moving, and the pizza kept baking. What he didn't know was that the FBI had caught his scent, his name, his system, and in New York, a case file was growing thicker by the day. Gaetano Badalamenti, the boy from Sinisi, had become a ghost in 3 countries. But ghosts leave trails, and this one smelled like cheese and blood. Morphine in Istanbul. Heroin in Palermo. It began in the golden hills of southeast Turkey, where farmers had grown poppies for centuries, delicate pink and white flowers swaying in the breeze, hiding within their pods a sap that could soothe pain or poison nations. In the late 1970s, the fields around Gaziantep and Diyarbakir teemed with morphine-bearing poppy. For generations, it had been harvested legally for medical use. But where there is product, there is profit. And where there is profit, there is always a shadow market. Gaetano Badalamenti knew that shadow well. From his safe houses in Spain and Sicily, he orchestrated the flow of raw morphine base out of Turkey, avoiding customs with the help of bribed officials, corrupt dock workers, and decades-old ties to contraband brokers in the Mediterranean. The morphine traveled in unmarked crates, sometimes disguised as olive oil shipments, sometimes packed within sacks of dried legumes. The cargo moved south overland, and by sea slipping through Greece or Syria, sometimes floating into the chaotic ports of Lebanon, before making landfall in Italy. The ports of Naples and Palermo had long served as open veins for smugglers, piercing arteries into the heart of Europe. But Palermo was special. Palermo was his. There, in quiet coastal villas and rural sheds buried beneath citrus groves, a network of makeshift laboratories transformed the brown morphine base into white crystalline heroin, nearly pure, chemically lethal, pharmacologically elegant. The chemists were not street junkies or high school dropouts. They were trained, Some had studied chemistry at university. They worked silently, gloved careful. The process was dangerous. A wrong move could lead to fire poisoning or death. But they were paid well, and they knew the stakes. Their instructions were precise. The product had to be clean. American addicts were growing savvier. Cut product was bad business. And Badalamenti didn't tolerate bad business. Once refined, the heroin was vacuum-sealed into bricks, layered with masking agents, and prepared for export. This is where the innovation began. Unlike previous trafficking operations, which relied on bulk shipments and criminal couriers, Badalamenti turned to commerce. He built a web of legitimate businesses: food export companies, freight forwarders, packaging suppliers. Their invoices were clean, their customs paperwork meticulous. Their trucks passed through checkpoints without pause. The heroin was smuggled in tomato cans, carefully resealed with hydraulic presses, hidden among real food supplies. Or it came embedded in blocks of Parmesan cheese, cut precisely to fit hidden compartments, then resealed with paraffin wax. Sometimes it traveled in machinery bolts, engine parts, and pasta rollers sent to Italian-American restaurants that had never once used them. Each shipment was small, precise. No greed, no bulk, just consistency. The goods were sent across the Atlantic, bound for New York, Chicago, Miami. Destination: pizza parlors. Each shipment was met by handlers, men who worked double shifts, who answered to no names, who disappeared after deliveries. They stored the heroin in freezers, in wall panels, in boxes marked anchovies. And always the cover of pizza was perfect. Pizza was Italian. Pizza was comfort. Pizza was trust. Who would suspect a smiling baker? Who would investigate a marinara-stained apron or a flour-dusted delivery van? Meanwhile, the U.S. heroin market ballooned. Between 1979 and 1984, overdoses rose nearly 45% in urban centers where Badalamenti's network operated. Addicts spoke in whispers of a new, stronger dope, pure Sicilian, some called it. Others just said the white fire. But what no one knew, neither the users nor the dealers, was that this was industrial. Not gang-driven chaos, but supply chain mastery. Badalamenti's network functioned like a global corporation. It had procurement, turkey manufacturing, Palermo logistics, Naples distribution, New York and retail, the pizza shops. There were no written contracts. Only blood ties, decades-old loyalty, and the threat of disappearance. In this enterprise there were no shareholders, only survivors. But nothing that efficient can stay hidden forever, especially when greed grows. A shipment went missing in transit. A handler in Toronto vanished with 2 kilos. The whispers became rumors. The rumors became fear. And in Palermo, one of Badalamenti's labs was raided by Italian police. They didn't find the heroin, but they found lab equipment, precursors, notebooks. Enough to raise flags. It wasn't long before Interpol sent the first alerts to American counterparts. Sicily's heroin production had doubled. No known route could explain the distribution volume. Someone was building a pipeline that no one could see. The DEA was already watching the ports. The FBI was watching the streets. But now the name Badalamenti crossed desks in both agencies, highlighted, underlined, pinned to bulletin boards behind locked doors. And in the middle of it all, still untouched, still unseen, Gaetano Badalamenti watched from afar. He had created an empire of white dust, fueled by poppies refined in secrecy, disguised in crust and cheese. But the next mistake wouldn't be his. It would come from within: tomatoes and trafficking. To the customer waiting at the counter, the can of tomatoes was just another ingredient, a vital base for a family recipe passed down through generations. But in certain kitchens, in select corners of New Jersey and Chicago, that can held far more than sauce. Beneath a false bottom, lined with aluminum foil nestled in between paste and pulp, was a sealed packet of high-grade heroin. It traveled thousands of miles to reach this moment, concealed within the ordinary. That was the genius of the system, hiding in plain sight. Badalamenti's network had elevated trafficking into choreography. His genius wasn't just in sourcing or distribution, it was in camouflage. Every layer of the system was built to resemble legitimacy. The shipments were routed through shell companies registered in Italy and the U.S. import/export businesses with actual payrolls, leases, and accounting books. Trucks bore clean decals, delivery receipts were stamped and signed, and customs officers were offered just enough courtesy and incentive not to look too close. The tomato cans were the most elegant vessel, but not the only one. Bags of mozzarella bricks of espresso, sealed drums of anchovies, every staple of the Italian-American kitchen became a potential container for narcotics. And when the shipments arrived, they were directed to pizzerias not owned outright by the Mafia, but run by trusted intermediaries. Many of these shop owners didn't even know the full extent of the product they were receiving. Some looked the other way. Others were told not to ask questions. The pizzas were real. The customers were real. The cash flowed both ways, dollars for pizza and untraceable funds laundered through nightly receipts. In Milwaukee, one pizzeria that never served more than 50 pies a day somehow reported earnings that rivaled a downtown steakhouse. In Manhattan, another pizza joint remained open 24/7, but never hired more than one cook. It was a mirage. Every family-run shop was a node in a larger circuit, each with specific drop schedules, courier protocols, and coded communication. Drivers never took the same route twice. Deliveries were sometimes rerouted mid-transit via phone booths using disposable coins. But the real brilliance lay in how the heroin moved through the system without ever staying still. The pizzerias didn't stockpile. They redistributed. A shipment would land in New York, and within 48 hours portions would be en route to smaller cities: Pittsburgh, Buffalo, St. Louis. This decentralization made detection difficult. It also diluted liability. No one location ever held enough weight to justify federal investigation on its own. And as the drugs moved, so did the money. Large bills were kept out of bank accounts. Instead, proceeds were collected by roving cash couriers who drove unmarked vans and dropped duffel bags at front businesses, travel agencies, car washes, insurance offices. From there, the funds were split. Some went offshore to accounts in Switzerland and Panama. Others were reinvested in new pizza shops or legitimate properties. To the outside world, it was a booming success story of immigrant entrepreneurship. The American dream, some said. A Sicilian man arrives with recipes and determination, builds an empire of flavor. But the reality was far more corrosive. In neighborhoods where these pizzerias thrived, so too did addiction. Heroin seeped into alleys, into nightclubs, into high schools. Young men and women, some barely out of childhood, vanished into the depths of dependency. But Badalamenti didn't see faces. He saw numbers. Units moved, profits collected, logistics executed, and he rarely interfered. He left the daily operations to others' men, like Salvatore Catalano, who oversaw multiple pizzerias in Brooklyn, and Giuseppe Ganci, who coordinated transport between New Jersey and Illinois. They in turn managed their own lieutenants, soldiers, couriers, bagmen. The network had layers, redundancies, fail-safes. But no system is perfect. In one instance, a shipment was intercepted by customs officials at JFK. The consignment had been mislabeled. A rookie inspector flagged the container due to weight discrepancies. Inside 3.5 kilograms of heroin packed in vacuum-sealed tomato cans. The trail was buried deep, but it was a crack. Investigators began to look closer. They ran financial audits on the importers. They tracked vehicle patterns. They started frequenting pizzerias, not as customers, but as silent observers. And then came a second break. A low-level courier in Philadelphia, arrested during a routine traffic stop, panicked when officers found $400,000 in a false compartment in his van. Under pressure, he gave up an address. The address led to a storage unit in Newark. Inside, more cans, more heroin, and most importantly, ledgers. Code names, routes, quantities. They weren't enough to dismantle the network, but they were enough to see the shape of it. The FBI realized they were facing something unprecedented. A mafia operation so embedded in legal trade, so compartmentalized that a single misstep wouldn't collapse it. It had to be unraveled thread by thread. They needed eyes. They needed ears. They needed a voice from the inside. And as they searched for that voice in Sicily, one man was preparing to break the most sacred vow of all. Whispers on the wire. It started as static, garbled words in thick Sicilian dialect, barely decipherable, buried beneath the hum of cafe music and traffic noise. The agents listening didn't understand it at first. They didn't need to. What mattered was that people were talking, and they didn't know someone was listening. In a dim office on the 12th floor of the Jacob K. Javits Federal Building, reels of magnetic tape spun day and night. Dozens of cassette decks captured thousands of hours of whispered exchanges. Behind one-way glass, FBI linguists and mob experts leaned over headphones, parsing fragments of conversation that might crack open a case they barely understood. The wiretaps had been authorized after months of groundwork. Each one took a judge's signature affidavits and coordinated efforts with Italian authorities. The first taps were installed in the back room of Trinacria Pizza in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. A small microphone embedded in the ceiling fan caught every breath above a cheese-stained table where deals were whispered over espresso. The results were immediate. Men spoke in circles. They never said heroin. They said flour, firewood, or simply the good stuff. Locations were the oven, the wedding, our cousin's house. And still the agents listened. They built dictionaries. They cross-referenced metaphors. A conversation about a hot shipment of tomatoes arriving early from the south turned out to mean a heroin drop from Naples landing in Miami a week ahead of schedule. But the real gold was in tone, intonation, panic, deference. When a voice on tape went suddenly quiet, agents knew a boss had entered the room. When laughter turned stiff, they knew a mistake had been made. They learned to distinguish the voices, Catalano's gravelly baritone, Gansey's clipped nervousness, the soft-spoken warnings of runners desperate not to say too much. And slowly, a map emerged. The network had nodes, and each voice revealed connections. Who deferred to whom, who approved what. Gaetano Badalamenti himself never appeared on tape. But his name, Tanu, floated like a ghost through every conversation. He won't like this. Has Tanu approved the numbers? Tell Palermo we need Tanu's blessing. He was distant, unseen, but ever present. The reverence was unmistakable. The surveillance expanded. Bugs were planted in cars in bakery storerooms and fake fire extinguishers mounted inside import offices. The agents followed suspects to restaurants, strip clubs, funeral homes. At a wedding in Staten Island, an entire FBI team posed as caterers just to plant a recorder beneath the band's speaker cabinet. They caught whispers about delays in Chicago, disputes over purity, and even rumors of internal executions. One recording captured a heated argument between two lieutenants. The words were muffled, but clear enough someone had skimped on product and someone else was going to disappear. What emerged from this was not just a web, but a culture. These men operated like businessmen, but they spoke like warriors. Every shipment was a campaign, every delivery a battle maneuver, every delay a potential betrayal. But even as the tapes piled up, the case felt slippery. Judges wanted more than metaphors. Juries couldn't convict on code. The prosecution needed something tangible. And then came the call that changed everything. Late one Friday night in 1983, a federal agent in Manhattan picked up a secure line from Rome. A defector had emerged, one with a name, a story, and blood on his hands. Tommaso Buscetta. The name sent ripples through the building. Buscetta was no ordinary mobster. He had been a trusted member of the Sicilian Cosa Nostra for decades. A smooth-talking, immaculately dressed insider who had survived multiple wars, multiple arrests, and had dined with bosses across continents. Now, he was offering to talk. But there was a catch. Buscetta wanted protection. His family had been slaughtered back in Palermo, sons, brothers, even a nephew. The new Mafia leadership, led by the brutal Salvatore Riina, had purged anyone loyal to the old guard, especially those tied to Badalamenti. Buscetta had fled, hid, survived. But he was done hiding. And he wasn't just going to confess, he was going to explain. He knew the structure, the ranks, the unwritten laws. He knew which pizzerias were fronts. He knew which weddings were code for drops. He even knew the names of American operatives who had never appeared in any report. He was the missing piece. The translator. The voice who could send the mozzarella into admissible evidence of international narcotics trafficking. Within weeks, he was flown to the United States under heavy guard. His interview transcripts ran thousands of pages. His cooperation opened the floodgates. Armed with his testimony and the damning tapes, prosecutors built the scaffolding for a historic indictment. Over 35 individuals were named. Dozens of pizza shops were flagged. Financial records previously ignored were revisited and linked to offshore accounts. But Badalamenti still loomed beyond reach, hidden, untouched, for now. The man who flipped the table. Tommaso Buscetta did not look like a man on the run. His suits were pressed, his hair swept back in dark, thick waves, and his voice, though soft, carried the weight of graves. But by the time he stepped off a guarded plane onto American soil in 1984, he was already a man half dead, with a past full of secrets and a future written in blood. For years he had danced between shadows. A native of Palermo and a lifelong mafioso, Buscetta was no street thug. He spoke multiple languages, frequented opera houses, and wore cologne that cost more than some of his soldiers' monthly earnings. He was in every sense a man of honor until the mafia he loved turned against him. He watched them slaughter his family. Not just brothers and cousins, his sons, killed without mercy in alleyways and vineyards, their only crime sharing his name. Salvatore Riina had declared a new order in Sicily, one where loyalty meant nothing and mercy was weakness. In this new regime, even whispers of dissent earned a bullet. Buscetta fled first to Brazil, then into hiding before being arrested and quietly extradited to the United States under an identity so guarded even his guards didn't know his destination. He didn't come to confess. He came to educate. In a sealed room somewhere in New York, flanked by agents who could hardly believe the moment Buscetta began to speak, he didn't shout. He didn't beg. He told stories. Stories about dinners that ended in murder, about priests who passed messages between bosses, about the invisible laws that governed the Cosa Nostra like a religion, about votes cast not by hands, but by silence. He mapped out the Mafia like a company, explained its hierarchy capo soldiers consiglieri. He named names, some already known, others buried in code and speculation for years. But what stunned the FBI most was his clarity about the pizza connection. He described the heroin pipeline not just as a route, but as a living organism grown, nurtured, and sustained by men who wore bakers' hats by day and ordered killings by night. He knew Catalano. He had met Gansey. He had even spoken years earlier with Badalamenti himself, who in a private meeting had once mused about hiding heroin in things Americans trust the most. Maybe their food. Buscetta spoke for weeks. His words, captured on tape and translated line by line, became the foundation for an indictment so wide, so sweeping, it shook even the hardened minds at the FBI. His cooperation came at a cost. His face would vanish from the world. The U.S. Marshals placed him in witness protection. His identity would change. So would his children's. He would never return to Palermo, never again walk the streets of his youth. But he had made peace with that. The Mafia, as he once knew it, was already dead. He was burying the rest. Armed with his testimony, the Department of Justice moved fast. Grand juries convened. Federal prosecutors drafted charges across multiple states. Arrest warrants were issued. On a cold morning in November 1984, teams of agents simultaneously raided 20 pizza shops across 5 states. Doors were kicked in, registers seized, flour dust mixed with shattered glass. In some shops they found nothing. In others, bricks of heroin, cash-stuffed shoeboxes, ledgers written in coded Italian slang. Most importantly, they found people. Catalano was arrested in Brooklyn, Gansey in Queens. Lower-level operatives were rounded up like dominoes. Some tried to run, others tried to cut deals. But the net was closing, and the case had momentum. Still, the man at the center, the ghost they had chased from Istanbul to Palermo, remained free. Gaetano Badalamenti had vanished into Europe's underbelly. Authorities believed he was in Madrid operating under a false passport. Surveillance teams tracked sightings, listened to phone calls, chased rumors. He moved with care, rarely slept in the same place twice, traveled with a small entourage of loyalists, never used the same phone, never stayed long. But he made one mistake. A single call to an old associate in Naples, a voice that said, "Tell them the tomatoes have gone bad." It was enough. Interpol moved. Spanish authorities cooperated. And on April 8, 1984, inside a quiet apartment in the Salamanca district of Madrid, Gaetano Badalamenti was finally arrested. He didn't fight. He didn't speak. He stood in his suit and tie, adjusted his cufflinks, and surrendered with the cold dignity of a man who had known this moment was always waiting. The extradition to the United States took months, but when he landed in New York, every camera turned, every headline burned. The Pizza King falls, heroin in a slice, from Sicily to Rikers. In court he pleaded not guilty, sat through proceedings like a banker at an audit, silent, composed, expressionless. But behind that calm lay the ruin of an empire. An empire undone not by violence, not by turf wars, but by a man who had once taken a vow of silence and chose to break it. Tommaso Buscetta never looked back. The Pizza Connection trial. The courtroom at the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York had never seen anything quite like it. Over 30 defendants, nearly 24 lawyers, mountains of wiretaps, documents, ledgers, and testimonies spanning continents, years, and languages. It was by every metric a monster. But the prosecutors were ready. On September 30th, 1985, the doors opened on what would become the longest criminal trial in American history. They called it United States vs. Badalamenti, but in truth it was the U.S. against an entire philosophy, one of secrecy, corruption, and empire cloaked in mozzarella and marinara. The defendants filed in like characters from a dark opera. Gaetano Badalamenti, dressed sharply in European suits, sat expressionless. His son, Vito, flanked him in air, entangled in his father's downfall. Alongside them were Catalano Ganci and a rotating roster of lieutenants and distributors. Some tried to look defiant. Others couldn't meet the jury's eyes. The charges were staggering. Conspiracy to import and distribute heroin, participation in a continuing criminal enterprise, money laundering, RICO violations, firearms and violence in furtherance of trafficking. The lead prosecutor, Louis Freeh, stood before the jury with a simple statement. These men sold poison for profit. They hid it in your dinner. They did it with precision, and they did it thinking no one would ever stop them. Then came the evidence. The jury listened to hundreds of hours of wiretapped conversations. Each tape began the same: a timestamp, a location, then the crackle of audio, sometimes laughter, sometimes whispers, occasionally silence followed by a single word approved. Agents translated code. A conversation about hot tomatoes in Buffalo was dissected line by line until jurors understood it meant shipment delivered, quality confirmed. Then came Buscetta. His testimony stretched across days. His delivery was calm, confident, never rushed. He explained not only what had happened, but why it had happened, the motives, the rules, the subtle power plays. When asked to identify Badalamenti, he didn't point. He nodded slowly. He is there. Gaetano, the boss of bosses for this operation. The defense attempted to strike back. They challenged the tapes. They questioned Buscetta's credibility, calling him a traitor, a killer, a man trading secrets for sanctuary. But the weight of the evidence was impossible to ignore. Customs officers testified about heroin in tomato cans. DEA agents explained transport routes and financial irregularities. Forensic accountants showed how cash from pizza parlors moved through offshore banks, often through bogus shell corporations. And then came the human toll. Addiction counselors, doctors, and family members of overdose victims took the stand. They spoke of lost children, destroyed marriages, hollowed neighborhoods. They put faces to the poison. One mother held up the sweater her son had worn the day he died from a heroin overdose at 16. Her voice didn't tremble. Her eyes didn't blink. He thought it was just a stronger high, she said. No one told him it came from a pizza shop. The trial lasted 17 months. Jurors rotated. One fainted. Another was dismissed for violating a gag order. Court reporters went through over 1 million words. Newspapers reported daily updates like a serialized crime novel. The Pizza Connection, once a joking code name inside the FBI, became national shorthand for betrayal and decay. And in all that time, Badalamenti never once took the stand. He sat still, his eyes heavy, his silence louder than any confession. On March 2, 1987, after deliberating for 14 days, the jury returned its verdicts. 17 defendants were convicted. Badalamenti was found guilty on all major counts. The courtroom was silent as the foreperson read each name, each charge, each verdict. One by one, the pillars of the operation collapsed. At sentencing, the judge didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You used food to disguise death," he said, "and you used community to hide destruction. That ends today." Gaetano Badalamenti was sentenced to 45 years in federal prison. His son Vito received a similar fate. Others faced sentences ranging from 10 years to life. But even as the gavel fell and chains tightened, the real impact of the trial was only beginning. For law enforcement, it was a blueprint. For the Mafia, a warning. And for the American public, a jarring reminder that evil rarely arrives in obvious form. Sometimes it comes with a smile and a slice. The fall of a Don prison did not humble Gaetano Badalamenti. It simply changed his address. After the trial, he was transferred to a maximum security federal facility in Marion, Illinois. It wasn't a courtroom anymore. It was concrete and wire thick with the scent of sweat and disinfectant. The sharp suits were gone. So were the fine shoes. Now he wore state-issued gray and moved under the eye of guards who didn't care who he used to be. But Badalamenti was still a Don in posture and silence, in the subtle way others shifted when he walked through the yard. Even among other inmates, killers, traffickers, soldiers from rival syndicates, his presence held gravity. He spoke little, read often, kept his circle small. In interviews, he remained unrepentant. He referred to heroin as a commodity. He denied direct involvement in trafficking despite the mountain of evidence. And when asked if he regretted what had happened to the victims, the overdoses, the lost lives, he only shrugged. "They bought what they wanted," he said once. "We only provided." But behind bars, control slipped away. The empire he had built so carefully, layered so elegantly disguised, began to fracture. Without his steady hand, factions turned inward. Remaining operatives in the U.S. were scattered, watched, or indicted. In Sicily, the vacuum left by his exile was filled by more brutal men, most notably Salvatore Riina, whose reign of terror turned Palermo into a war zone. The old Mafia, with its rules and rituals, was dying. The new one didn't care for strategy. It only wanted blood. Badalamenti watched this from afar, through letters, through smuggled newspapers. He saw friends killed in the streets, properties seized, safe houses burned. In his quiet cell, he saw the seeds of his own ambition rot from within. His son Vito, imprisoned alongside him in a different facility, fared worse. Young, proud, and angry, Vito struggled under the weight of a name that no longer opened doors. He fought with other inmates, was sent to solitary more than once. There were rumors he tried to hang himself, though the Bureau of Prisons never confirmed them. What haunted Gaetano most wasn't the trial, it was legacy. He had built something meant to endure, something as invisible and permanent as air. Now it crumbled in headlines, court filings, and whispers from the streets of Brooklyn to the alleys of Shinisi. And yet in letters seized by authorities, he still clung to the illusion of control. He wrote to distant relatives using coded language, spoke of old recipes of delivering ingredients of keeping the ovens warm. But no one was listening anymore. In Palermo, his name became taboo. Younger mafiosi considered him outdated, a man whose obsession with order had blinded him to the chaos around him. To them, Badalamenti was a ghost, a symbol of a time when the Mafia pretended to be noble. In America, his story was slowly buried beneath fresher scandals, newer crimes. The pizza connection faded from the front page. A new generation knew the name only as trivia, a dark anecdote from the annals of criminal innovation. But in Marion, time moved differently. Guards observed him, quiet, clean, never violent. Occasionally he would hum old Sicilian folk songs under his breath, his voice barely audible beneath the fluorescent buzz of prison lights. He received few visitors. His wife came only once. She was tired, worn thin by exile, trial, and shame. She sat across from him in the visitation room, her hands trembling as she placed them on the table. "They still speak your name," she said. "I built something real," he replied. "No," she said quietly. "You sold poison." In 2004, after nearly 2 decades in prison, Gaetano Badalamenti died from heart failure. There was no fanfare, no black Cadillacs, no weeping crowds. His body was returned to Sicily in a sealed casket received in silence by a family too broken to mourn in public. He was buried not far from where he was born, in the same soil that had once raised olive trees and blood oaths. The inscription on his grave bore only his name and dates. No titles, no declarations, just silence. But his story didn't end there. The Pizza Connection trial became a reference point for international drug enforcement. Law schools studied it. FBI agents cited it in lectures. It became the case that proved how criminal empires could evolve not just with guns and threats, but with shipping manifests and tax records. Badalamenti had shown the world that the Mafia didn't need to hide in shadows. It could live in daylight, on menus, in storefronts, in the crust of a pizza slice passed between hands. And in doing so, he revealed something far more frightening than violence. He revealed how easy it is to accept evil when it's packaged in something familiar. The Don had fallen. But the blueprint he left behind would haunt investigators for decades to come. The Addicted Nation. Long after the courtroom lights dimmed and the last of the defendants were locked away, the echoes of the Pizza Connection continued to ring, not in law offices or prison cells, but in the veins of the American streets. Heroin didn't disappear with the arrests. The flow slowed, but the scars remained. From the Bronx to Detroit, from Miami's corners to St. Louis's back alleys, an entire generation had been touched by the white powder that arrived not in bricks or barrels, but in pizza boxes, tomato cans, and the soft hands of the American dream. Throughout the 1980s, overdose rates climbed to unprecedented levels. The drug was purer, stronger, deadlier. Emergency rooms reported young adults arriving unconscious, lips blue, pulses shallow, after using what they thought was just another fix. But this wasn't street-cut heroin. It was lab-grade Sicilian, refined, marketed through a distribution network more organized than some corporations. Cities scrambled to respond. Methadone clinics expanded, outreach programs multiplied. But it wasn't enough. The Pizza Connection network had shifted the dynamic. Heroin was no longer confined to backroom deals and shadowy corners. It had entered suburbia. Affluent teens were found dead in their parents' homes. Construction workers collapsed during lunch breaks. Nurses and students and fathers and sons. The poison spared no category. It wasn't just a crime story anymore. It was a public health crisis. The media tried to keep up. Reports poured out. Talk shows debated the new face of addiction. But few understood the depth of what had happened. This wasn't an epidemic caused by chaos. It was engineered, built, shipped, delivered. The business model had worked. For every ounce of heroin sold, a life was endangered. For every storefront protected by plausible deniability, a household unraveled. Children went to school while their parents sank into dependency. In some neighborhoods, entire blocks were hollowed out tenants, evicted homes foreclosed, silence replacing laughter. But the damage was not just emotional, it was generational. In areas hardest hit by the Pizza Connection's reach, school dropout rates rose. Crime followed addiction. Prisons swelled with the very users that the system had hooked. The dealers got rich. The victims got time. And as these communities struggled, the system that enabled their suffering remained difficult to punish. Because how do you prosecute a network that used invoices and inventory slips? How do you condemn a criminal who never touched a gun, never stepped on American soil during the height of his enterprise? The justice system had done its job technically. The bosses were caught. The trial had ended. The gavel had fallen. But justice is not the same as healing. In Buffalo, a father of two died in 1991 from a relapse 6 years clean. The heroin had changed hands many times before reaching him, but somewhere in its lineage, it had passed through a pizza parlor linked to the network. His widow never knew the name Badalamenti, but she remembered the red and white awning of the restaurant down the block. In New Jersey, a teenager named Erica overdosed at 17. Her mother found her in the living room, head tilted back, music still playing in her headphones. The needle had fallen between couch cushions. She had been using for less than 3 months. Her boyfriend testified that the baggie came from a man nicknamed Mozzarella Mike. The origin traced back to a supply route once used by the Pizza Connection. The legacy of that operation lived on not in its leadership, but in its residue. Addiction doesn't vanish when supply lines are severed. It evolves. It adapts. By the early 1990s, Mexican cartels began to take over routes abandoned by the Sicilian mob. They learned from Badalamenti's model how to launder money, how to decentralize shipments, how to use legitimate businesses as shields. They studied what had worked and what had failed. In many ways, the Pizza Connection wasn't just a story of criminal ingenuity, it was a prototype. A handbook for how to poison a country quietly, efficiently, profitably. And the price was staggering. By 2000, the U.S. opioid crisis had taken a new shape. Prescription pills now joined heroin in wrecking communities. But the roots could still be traced to the original betrayal, to the day when heroin was placed in tomato cans and slipped into the bloodstream of a trusting nation. It wasn't just a product, it was a strategy. And while the names have changed, the method remains. What the Pizza Connection left behind wasn't just headlines or convictions. It left behind empty homes, hollow families, a country still clawing its way out of a nightmare disguised in crust and cheese. Lessons in blood and flour. The story of the Pizza Connection is at first glance about crime, about mafiosi in suits, heroin in cans, and pizza parlors used as smoke screens for international trafficking. But beneath the operations and indictments lies something far more enduring, a warning. This wasn't just a criminal empire. It was a mirror held up to modern society, a reflection of how easily evil can be wrapped in the ordinary. It showed us that corruption doesn't always wear a ski mask or carry a gun. Sometimes it smells like basil and garlic. Sometimes it greets you with a smile and a hot slice. The most haunting truth: it worked. For nearly a decade, a silent machine moved poison across oceans, across borders, and into the hands of the vulnerable. It did so without gunfights, without press conferences, without the theatrics of Hollywood's version of the Mafia. It operated in routine, in familiarity, in trust. Gaetano Badalamenti understood that power wasn't just in muscle. It was in perception, in routine, in the illusion of normalcy. He sold heroin by selling comfort, by weaponizing a cultural icon, by building an empire, not in alleyways but behind polished counters and wood-fired ovens. He proved that crime, when camouflaged well enough, can embed itself into daily life, into a neighborhood, a family, a craving. And in doing so, he taught law enforcement a painful lesson. It's not enough to chase shadows. You have to learn how to see in daylight. The aftermath of the Pizza Connection trial led to significant reforms. Financial regulations tightened. Customs screenings grew more rigorous. The RICO Act gained sharper teeth, used more confidently against criminal networks operating under corporate veneers. Agencies like the FBI and DEA started to think differently, not just about drugs, but about crime itself. They began to study patterns, build profiles of front businesses, follow the money instead of the blood. It wasn't just about catching criminals anymore. It was about understanding their infrastructure. But perhaps the most important shift came from the public. For the first time, many Americans realized that addiction wasn't just a personal failure. It was also a product of engineering, a consequence of systems designed to exploit profit and discard. The heroin crisis opened wounds that would never fully heal, but it also sparked movements, community outreach, educational campaigns, a demand for accountability from not only drug traffickers, but the institutions that enabled them, knowingly or not. Today you can walk into any pizza shop in New York or Philadelphia or Chicago and smell the familiar mix of dough and heat. The menus are handwritten. The cooks wear aprons, the cash register clicks like a heartbeat, and yet for those who remember, there's always a trace of unease, a reminder of what once lurked behind the smiles. The lesson isn't that pizza shops are dangerous. It's that nothing is above suspicion when power and profit are involved. The Pizza Connection has faded from headlines, but not from memory. Its blueprints still circulate in the criminal underworld. Its tactics have been replicated, modified, enhanced. But the justice it faced, slow, methodical, relentless, set a precedent. There are still ghosts out there, still front businesses hiding backroom deals, still innocents caught in crossfire they never see coming. But there are also agents listening to the static, investigators reading between lines, communities remembering what happens when we stop paying attention. Badalamenti is gone. His empire crumbled, but the flower he scattered still leaves footprints. And following those prints, That's the mission of justice. In the quiet after the trial, after the headlines faded and the microphones turned away, the echoes of the Pizza Connection remain. Not in the volume of its violence, but in the precision of its design. It reminds us that some of the darkest crimes don't hide in the shadows, they blend into the wallpaper. They nod politely at the door. They wait until we're too busy, too trusting, too tired to notice. But someone always notices, and as long as they do, the trail continues. Thank you for following this crime-solving journey. If you find it interesting, don't forget to subscribe to the Crime Trail channel so you don't miss out on upcoming exciting stories.